Linux Mint was officially called a hostile distribution by a GNOME developer. The reason? GNOME Calendar. In this video, we're going to talk about a dispute that recently erupted within the Linux community, but whose roots go much deeper than they might appear at first glance. And as is often the case in the open source world, what started as a technical discussion quickly turned into an increasingly heated exchange between two people who, at least in theory, should be on the same side: developers of free and open source software. This is the conflict between Linux Mint, one of the most popular Linux distributions for everyday users, and the team behind GNOME Calendar. If you've been following the Linux world for a while, you've probably noticed that these kinds of tensions aren't uncommon. However, they rarely become as public and as intense as they have in this case. The story resurfaced recently after Hari Rana, one of the core developers of GNOME Calendar, published a detailed account on his personal blog about a dispute that actually began many months earlier. In the fall of 2025, Rana described Linux Mint as a hostile distribution and publicly revisited a discussion that had taken place on GitLab, a discussion that wasn't finally resolved until several months later when the issue was closed rather decisively. So what triggered all of this? At its core, it was a seemingly simple request. The GNOME Calendar developers no longer provided support for the older versions of the application that Linux Mint continued to distribute through its own package repositories. Rana asked Mint to remove or replace the links to GNOME Calendar within the application's interface, especially the support links that directed users straight to the GNOME team. On top of that, he made an even more sensitive request: to change the application's icon and branding. At first glance, the reasoning behind these requests seemed perfectly reasonable. Users running older versions of GNOME Calendar distributed by Linux Mint would sometimes report issues directly to the GNOME developers. As a result, the GNOME team found itself investigating bugs that had either already been fixed in newer releases or were caused by changes introduced by Mint during the packaging process. In other words, the GNOME Calendar developers felt they were spending time and effort supporting a version of the application they neither maintained nor controlled anymore. If the request had stopped at removing the support links, the discussion likely would have ended quickly and without controversy. It's a perfectly reasonable request. If you don't support a particular version, it doesn't make sense for the application to direct users to you for help. However, the rebranding request completely changed the nature of the debate. At that point, it was no longer just a practical issue of technical support, but a much broader question. How freely can software licensed under a free software license be modified and redistributed? This is where Linux Mint founder Clement Lefebvre stepped in. He explained that the package versions provided by Mint are closely tied to the versions available in Ubuntu and Debian, the distributions on which Linux, Mint, and LMDE are based. In other words, removing the package from Mint's repositories would not automatically guarantee a newer version for users, because the exact same older version could still come directly from the underlying distribution. Lefebvre also emphasized that the only real difference between the GNOME Calendar version in Ubuntu LTS and the one in Linux Mint is a single minor patch that fixes a broken menu when the application is used in desktop environments other than GNOME. He further pointed out that millions of users already run the same versions, 46 and 48, through Ubuntu, LTS, and Debian stable, and rhetorically asked whether the GNOME Calendar team also intended to ask those major distributions to stop shipping the application. The discussion quickly became confrontational. After 6 months of silence, Jeff Fortin, another member of the GNOME team, stepped in and once again requested either the complete removal of the GNOME Calendar package from Linux Mint or a full rebranding, including package names and executable names, so that it would be clear the software had no connection to the code officially tested and supported by the GNOME team. Fortin backed up his argument with concrete numbers. At the time, Linux Mint's repositories provided GNOME Calendar versions ranging from 3.36 to 46. And even version 46 was already 4 releases, or roughly 2 years, behind the latest upstream version. He pointed out that since the release of version 41, the GNOME team had fixed more than 450 bugs, averaging around 50 fixes per release, while many Linux Mint users continued reporting issues that had already been resolved long ago. Lefebvre responded by asking for specific details about what the GNOME developers actually objected to in Mint's modifications. He even linked to a particular commit, explaining that the only change applied to versions 46 and 48 was a small patch that fixed a broken menu in desktop environments other than GNOME, with no impact on the GNOME experience itself. At that point, Hari Rana gave a response that set the tone for the rest of the discussion. He said that no one on the GNOME team had the time to analyze the source code of Linux Mint's fork to determine exactly what was problematic, so their answer remained simply everything. According to Rana, the real issue was not that specific patch, but the fact that the versions distributed by Linux Mint were, as a whole, far too outdated, regardless of any modifications. Lefebvre went on to patiently explain the technical mechanism behind package distribution. Linux Mint 22.3 is built on top of Ubuntu 24.04 LTS, and its packages come from both Ubuntu's and Mint's repositories. If GNOME Calendar were removed from Mint's own repositories, users would automatically receive the version from Ubuntu's repositories, which is exactly the same version, version 46. In practice, removing the package from Mint would not change anything for end users, except that they would lose the small compatibility patch. The same logic applies to LMDE, where users would receive version 48 directly from Debian stable. The only real way for Mint to avoid this situation entirely would be for GNOME Calendar to be removed from Debian itself. Rana replied that if this was the technical solution, then Linux Mint could simply add the package to an internal blacklist, regardless of what happened in Debian or Ubuntu. He argued that it was Mint's responsibility, not the GNOME team's, to resolve the issue. At one point, Lefebvre proposed a compromise, patching the application's About dialog to remove the problematic support links without fully rebranding the product. However, he acknowledged that this would only be a short-term solution. The real issue, older versions remaining in stable distributions for long periods, would ultimately need to be addressed upstream, perhaps through a mechanism that automatically removes the support link once a version is no longer maintained. Maxim Therian, another participant in the discussion, raised an important question. How could the GNOME team implement such a solution without introducing either a form of phone home functionality, a connection that periodically checks the application's status, or a fixed expiration date embedded in the code? He also acknowledged that most of the misleading bug reports came from less experienced Linux Mint users who simply followed the About menu, unlike Debian users who are generally considered more experienced and aware that the information shown there may be outdated. Lefebvre continued exploring the idea, suggesting that if this was a broader GNOME project concern affecting distributions that freeze package versions for long periods, a simpler solution would be to patch the libadwaita library itself. Such a patch could be maintained permanently and would ideally be applied by Debian, solving the issue across all Debian-based distributions at once. At this point, the tone of the discussion changed dramatically. Rana rejected the idea of involving Debian in the solution, accusing Linux Mint of engaging in whataboutism and insisting that the responsibility rested solely with Mint, not with technical issues shared by other distributions. He emphasised that the GNOME team was not concerned with what Debian was doing, but with the fact that the Linux Mint package was the one consistently consuming their time and resources. Lefebvre replied with a very brief statement. If you don't care, then neither do we. That exchange effectively marked the moment when the discussion lost any realistic chance of remaining constructive. Rana continued by accusing Linux Mint of abusing its position as a downstream distributor, arguing that Mint was misleading its own users by directing them to report issues to the wrong place, and, in doing so, was also taking advantage of Debian's goodwill. Lefebvre responded with a sharp remark of his own, suggesting that as the conversation became more hostile, their willingness to help decreased accordingly. Another participant, ZipDocs, proposed a simple practical solution: require users to confirm their installed version through a bug report template before opening an issue. Lefebvre agreed that this could help. Rana pointed out, however, that many of the problematic reports did not come through a formal issue tracker, but instead arrived via social media or chat platforms such as Matrix, where no reporting template could be enforced. At that point, Lefebvre drew a somewhat sarcastic conclusion. If the issue was no longer just about support links, but about preventing anyone from running older versions of the application, then the real solution would be to change the software's license to a more restrictive one that would prohibit free redistribution and tightly control distribution channels. perhaps limiting the application to Snap, FlatHub, or GNOME OS. The discussion ended shortly afterward. Lefebvre closed the GitLab thread with a firm conclusion. In his view, the upstream developers wanted strict control over how the software was distributed, something that would likely require GNOME Calendar to abandon its free software licensing. He closed the discussion, arguing that the matter was ultimately for the upstream team alone to decide, and then locked the thread entirely. Beyond the heated exchanges, this dispute highlights a real and long-standing issue in the open source world. Stable distributions often continue shipping older versions of applications long after upstream teams have stopped supporting them, while ordinary users have no clear way of knowing where the responsibility of the distribution ends and where the responsibility of the original project begins. A simple solution could have existed from the very beginning, replacing the upstream support links with Mint's own support channels, but the discussion ended with both sides essentially talking past each other. Mint saw the request as an attempt to control software redistribution, while Rana viewed Mint's resistance as taking advantage of upstream developers' work. Thank you to all the channel members. Your support means a lot to me and helps keep the channel going. What do you think about this topic? Let me know your opinion in the comments, share this video if you enjoyed the content, and subscribe for more Linux Mint videos. See you in the next video.